A good Erev Shabbos, Chag Urim Sameach, a Freilich and Chanukah. The worst sound I've ever heard, I think, the sound that I can still hear if I think about it, but I try not to think about it too much, is the sound of a parent burying a child. May no one ever know of such things. The sound of this violation of what we think of as the natural order, the dirt that a parent places on the casket of a child, challenges much of the goodness and comfort that we think of in life. So, the saying goes, quite appropriately, may we never know of such things, and yet many of us do. I've heard that sound more than once, unfortunately. It's happened in my own family, and to a friend and a colleague, sadly enough, in our own kehillah. The reasons are of little matter. What matters is the tearing of the heart. Usually we tear our clothes in mourning. May we never know of such things, but most of us do. But how else can you describe a parent's loss of a child other than a torn heart? I don't want to say too much more directly on the topic. It's truly too awful for words. And yet, we are asked to step into that heart-rending state of being in this week's Parsha of Vayeishev. Joseph's brothers, out of a terrible jealousy, which is somehow nevertheless grounded in some version of reality, plot to fake their brother's death. Let's see just how we got to this point. Yaakov, who's also known now as Yisrael, since he wrestled the angel last week and got the blessing of the new name, had two wives, Rachel and Leah. And they also had two maidservants who gave birth altogether to Yaakov's children, 13 in all. By the end of last week's Parsha, 12 boys and a girl. We could talk about that all day long. And it seems that among these partners, Yaakov had a favorite, Rachel, as we've seen over the course of his life story. Rachel had a hard time getting pregnant and had but one son, Yosef. Much later in the story, long after the other children were all born, Rachel managed to have another child, but tragically, she passed away in childbirth. Lots to say there also, another time. So how could it be otherwise? Yaakov/Yisrael had a special place in his heart for these two sons of Rachel, Yosef and Benjamin. As our portion opens this week, Yaakov made for Yosef a special garment, a coat of many colors, as it's often called, a ketones pasim. It showed his special affection for Yosef, and don't think the other brothers didn't notice it. By the way, as they say, don't try this at home. The Gemara in Shabbos, which we're planning to start soon with our Monday study group, if there are any women interested in joining, now's the time to get on board with that group. The Gemara in Shabbos cautions us that a person should not discriminate among one's children, even to the extent of the threads of a garment, like that which Yaakov gave to Yosef, but not to the other brothers. This gift made the other brothers jealous and caused our descent into Egypt, says the Talmud. It's tempting to go into a whole side explanation here. I can't resist it completely, because I think about the Seder pretty much every day. I hold very strongly that view of Levi Yitzchak Berditchever, who said when he visited Israel, I like it that they say here, Hakol Beseder. They realize that everything depends on the Seder of the Pesach night. I like a good double entendre as much as the next guy, so that one stuck with me. Suffice it to say that karpas, one of our first steps in the Seder after Kiddush, when we dip a vegetable in salt water or vinegar, has an antecedent linguistically in just one place in the entire Tanakh, the whole Hebrew Bible. It's in the book of Esther, speaking about the decorations in the king's palace at the banquet, beginning of the story. Megillas Esther mentions chur, karpas, utcheles, draperies of white, fine cotton, and blue. That word appears only once, hapax legomenon. The scholars call it a word which is unique in the entire text. See, I told you I have a hard time resisting this kind of temptation. Cut to the chase. We dip a piece of parsley or an onion or a potato in salt water or vinegar, and we say that it's to remind ourselves of the tears that we shed in slavery in Egypt. Some say this custom has actually evolved over the centuries. We used to dip in red wine, and it was called karpas because the word for vegetable in classical Greek or classical Persian or whatever was kirpas, which sounds like karpas, and that is what the brothers dipped in blood to try to fool their father Yaakov into believing that Yosef had been killed by a wild animal. That whole trick, that whole ruse, where the brothers let jealousy get the best of them and planned to first kill their brother Yosef, and then they relented and just sold him into slavery, it ultimately resulted in the entire Jewish people, all of Beis Yaakov, all of Bnei Yisrael, becoming slaves to Pharaoh in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. So it's most appropriate to start the Seder with a remembrance of that dark moment in our history when the brothers dipped the coat of the Ketonet Pasim into the blood. At a certain point, we stopped dipping in wine to recall dipping the coat in blood for whatever reason, and we switched to something salty or sour, and we said it had to do with bitterness. That may be the origin, but I digress. Having sold their brother Yosef as human chattel to merchants traveling to Egypt, the others take his coat, dip it in blood, show it to their father, and invent this tall tale that he's been mauled to death by an animal. What a horrible story. But strangely enough, Yaakov doesn't buy it, at least at some level. The Torah says, as we'll read this week, Yaakov tore his garments. Vayikra Yaakov simlosav, vayasem sak b'mosnav. He put on sackcloth. Vayis abel, he was an avel, he was a mourner. He mourned al beno yamim rabim. He mourned for his son a long time. Then it says, Vayakumu kol banav, v'chol b'nosav l'nachamoy. His children came to comfort him. Listen to this. Vayima ein lehis nachem. He refused to be comforted. Refused to be comforted. What do you make of that? He could not be consoled. There was nothing that could console him. He was so swept up with grief that nothing could be of comfort to him. What must be going on in the heart and mind of a parent mourning a child? Again, most of us are fortunate not to know. And there's another way to look at this all, however, and that is that Yaakov knew what we all know, that Yosef actually was not dead at all. Now think about it. If it never occurred to you, we know because we're reading, and for that matter, we read last year and the year before, we read the whole story. We know that Yosef was not attacked by a wild animal. He was roughed up by the brothers and sold into slavery. So we know for a fact that he wasn't dead at all. The brothers know he's not dead because they're the ones who hatched this plan and carried it out. Presumably, their wives who came with them to comfort the patriarch Yaakov were all in the scheme also. I'm sure they got a briefing before they went to the Shiva house to say words of comfort for this pretend loss that really didn't occur. The only one in the story, according to the text, only one who doesn't know is Yaakov, or so we think. They're tricking their father into thinking that this most precious son was gone, but he refused to be consoled. Perhaps, maybe, possibly, he refused to be consoled because he knew somehow or other it wasn't true. Now, I interrupted the pasuk there, the Hemshech HaPasuk, the rest of the verse says, Vayomer ki ered al b'ni avel sha'ola v'yev oisai aviv. He says, Yaakov says, I will go down to the grave, I will go down to the grave mourning for my son, and he wept for him. Why this? Does that mean that he'll never be comforted for the loss? Maybe. Rabbi Yossi in Bereishis Rabbah, the main midrash on Genesis, says that there's a divine decree. In other words, the way the world works is after 12 months, the nature of things is that people somehow or other, by and large, for the most part, as a general rule, come to terms of a fashion with their loss. But only for a loss that has the contours of grief and mourning. This doesn't occur when the person is missing but not dead. Then there's no consolation. In our parsha, there's a 22-year gap, this parsha and the following parshas actually, in which Yaakov doesn't hear tell of Yosef. So how does he possibly know he's still alive? I always wondered to myself, why couldn't Yosef send a text or an email? Dad, I'm in Egypt, found a job, met a nice girl, all's well. or from my days, maybe this is going back in history, an aerogram, something, some kind of communication, no message, nothing. Commentaries try to figure this out also, and they say there was an oath of silence. All the brothers, as part of this plot to fool their father and do away with Yosef the dreamer, they took upon themselves, they imposed upon each other, and maybe even on Yosef, an oath, a vow not to speak about the reality behind the plot. So no one, not even Yosef, actually revealed what had transpired. So to this insight, the rabbis add yet another facet. Not everyone was bound by the oath. For example, Yitzchak, Isaac, who was still alive at the time of this parsha. He knew what had happened, but he was not bound by the oath of silence. Perhaps he didn't tell his son Yaakov, feeling that if God didn't reveal it to him through prophecy, maybe it wasn't meant to know. Maybe he wasn't meant to know. Maybe it was right that he didn't spill the beans. Maybe he did tell him. Or it could have been Serach bas Asher, who broke the news. She's a character we hear about a few times in the Chumash and throughout Tanakh and the Midrashim. She actually receives a bracha for long life from Yaakov for telling him the truth. It's actually a nice rhyming tune that she plays for him on her harp while he's in the middle of davening to break the news to him gently so it won't be a shock to his system. She tells him that his beloved son Yosef is alive in Egypt and he'll have sons there. It rhymes in the Midrash. Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer is where it's found. Yosef b'Mitzrayim, Yuldu lo al Birkayim, Menashe ve'Ephraim. I'm sure it sounded a lot better when she sang it. But Yaakov's so happy to hear this news, he blesses this grandchild with long life, which she indeed enjoys. Some say she lived 1,000 years. She remembered Yosef's burial place when it was time to leave Mitzrayim, time to go out of Egypt. She told the sages many generations later what it felt like, what it looked like when they went through the sea, when it split. Lots to say about Serach bas Asher. She's actually the only granddaughter of her generation mentioned, so that makes her very special. So back to the point of the story, Yaakov could not be comforted, would not be comforted, because at some level, for some reason, he felt or knew or realized or intuited that Yosef was not dead at all, but was rather still living somewhere. This also fits the rest of the verse, in which he says, I will go down to the grave mourning for my son. It sounds, on the face of it, like he's saying, I will spend the rest of my life mourning until I die. But the Midrash points out it could have a much simpler meaning. The parents that I alluded to at the beginning can go to graves of their children, and they can cry there, and they can mourn. And in time, somehow or other, maybe, possibly, they come to some kind of terms with their loss. If there's no grave, it's much more difficult for that to happen. Since there was no grave and no coming to terms, Yaakov lived with the grief. Although when he sensed that his beloved Yosef was not only alive and well, but had achieved high office in Egypt, he somehow had a feeling that all would come out well, somehow or other. You know, in Halacha, we have very clear, articulated rules about mourning. I know we have rules for everything, right? Okay, we're a people who likes to record and discuss things and record our findings. That's how we are. If a person feels excessive grief, they're still not allowed to sit more than 7 days of Shiva. At the end of 7 days, no matter how profound the loss was or how much it affected them, we say to them, now is the end of Shiva. It's time to get up from your mourning. Some people are ready to move on to the next stage. After 7 days, some people are not. The grief remains a very heavy burden. Nevertheless, we say, nope, that's the end of Shiva. Now you have to start getting back to life. Life is for the living. A person does continue to mourn for 30 days, shloshim. They don't cut their hair, they don't go to simchas, weddings, and so on. Grief is still hanging about them. But after 30 days, we say, that is the end of mourning. Go buy some new clothes, go to weddings and bar mitzvahs, rejoin life, even though we acknowledge, you acknowledge, we all recognize that yours has changed. The only exception to this rule is for a parent. For the reason of honoring our parents, kibud av v'em, mourning is observed for a full year. But nobody should make what I call the Queen Victoria mistake, no disrespect intended, putting on black and wearing mourning clothes really for the rest of your life. For her it was 40 years. We don't do that, no matter how great the love, no matter how great the loss. We have to accept the new reality and integrate it into our lives. Life is for the living. And yet, at some level, there's something very important to be learned from Yaakov's inability, unwillingness, or even refusal to be comforted. Somehow, to whatever degree he knew it, and however he knew it, he had hope. Very profound, real hope, even trust. And these midrashim that we discussed suggest he even had knowledge that things would turn out all right. It might take a while, but he didn't mourn and grieve and then move on. He kept the thoughts of Yosef with him, alive and well and vivid, thinking about and hoping for a happy reunion, which, spoiler alert, takes place 2 weeks from now in Parshas Vayigash Elav Yehuda. By the way, we get a few clues along the way that Yosef is also thinking of his father all along too, so it actually works both ways. The idea is they never give up hope. They refuse to accept things the way they are. Their vision is turned toward the future and better days to come. Maybe that's why Yaakov refused to be consoled when they told him that his son was gone. I think we're on solid ground to say that this is a signal quality of the Jewish people. We refuse to accept an imperfect world as it is. We refused to accept the unalterable fact of our exile from our homeland, even though it lasted 19 centuries. We continued davening 3 times a day, may our eyes behold the return to Zion, until it happened in 1948 and continues to happen today. Still, Israel is not perfect, and the world is far from perfect, far from perfect, and no one can accuse the Jews of accepting the world as the way it is. We know it can always be better. We feel a responsibility to make it so. Along the way, we rack up more than a few Nobel prizes for our efforts. As nice as that is, even that doesn't distract us from our refusal to be comforted, our refusal to accept an imperfect world, a world of injustice and pain and sickness and hunger and suffering and exile, a world where God's word and God's sovereignty is not allowed to enter and take root because of the treachery of human beings one to another, perhaps worst of all in the jealousies and petty envies and horrible schemes of one brother against another brother. We simply refuse to accept that this is as good as it gets. We maintain steadfastly, without compromise, that it can be better and it must be better, and we must work to make it better. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, we say, v'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena, it says in Pirkei Avos, it's not your responsibility to complete the task. You don't have to do all the work yourself, but at the same time, don't think for a minute that you're off the hook from fulfilling your part to make the world a better place. Jacob did not accept the death of his most beloved in life. Neither should we. The things that we love and we value most, in addition to one another, are godliness, as the Torah explains it to us. More specifically, justice, mercy, honesty, the common good and welfare of all humankind, beginning with brothers and extending to the brotherhood, or maybe siblinghood, of all humankind. Our age will tell us that such dreams are for suckers. They're pipe dreams. They're dreaming the impossible dream. Our reality comes from Yosef's dreams, from Pharaoh's dreams, or even the part played in this week's story, by the dreams of the butler and the baker in prison at the tail end of this week's parsha. We know that when you have a dream of a redeemed society and a redeemed world, it's too good to just let it go and move on. We live with that dream of return and restoration and redemption, and we have not let it go. And we won't let it go, not even if we live as long as Serach bat Asher herself, not if it takes 1,000 years or 3. We refuse to be comforted by the idea that we should have to settle for a world that is less than it can be, less than it should be. That's one reason we lit a candle to publicize miracles on Thursday night. And Friday afternoon, before Shabbat begins, we'll light 2 candles. Motzei Shabbos, we'll light 3. Because we take upon ourselves the holy responsibility of illuminating a dark world, and each day adding to the light. May the light continue to shine and continue to increase and grow until all the doubts, all the sadness, all the suffering is lit up with the light that God has been saving for us since the first day of creation. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Urim Sameach, Chodesh Tov.